The morning sunlight spilled softly across the bedroom, catching the edges of the curtains and painting golden stripes across the carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, carefully folding the scarf I had chosen last night, the one I imagined him noticing. Today was propose day, a day we had never formally celebrated, yet it carried a weight I had felt for weeks. I smoothed the scarf across my lap, and for a fleeting moment, a faint worry tugged at my chest, almost imperceptible, before I brushed it aside. Outside, the city was waking slowly. I could hear the faint hum of distant traffic, a car honking, a dog barking somewhere down the street. These ordinary sounds usually fade into background noise, but today, each one pulled me briefly from my thoughts, reminding me that life outside our apartment was continuing, indifferent to the anticipation in my heart. The coffee machine gurgled in the kitchen. I poured the hot liquid into my favorite mug, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. A soft ping from my phone startled me briefly, a reminder of the modern world, but it was nothing significant. Yet, it was a small thread of reality that grounded my daydream. I moved to the mirror, adjusting the fall of my hair. The soft waves framed my face just right, and I practiced the curve of my smile, the way I imagined him would see it. Not rehearsed, not forced, calculated in its gentleness, like a quiet promise. My reflection looked back, calm and hopeful, the same reflection that had rehearsed countless tiny gestures of affection over months. The bouquet lay on the dining table, delicate blush roses that smelled faintly sweet, their petals perfectly arranged, as if each one knew the importance of today. I had written a card, my words both simple and heavy with intention. Forever is a promise I believe in, today and always. I traced the letters lightly with my fingertip, imagining him understanding the depth of my trust. Not a single flourish was unnecessary. Each word was meant to carry the gravity of my hope. I imagined his arrival, the casual opening of the door, the soft shuffle of his steps, the warmth of his eyes meeting mine. Perhaps a slight grin, one that hides mischief but conveys affection. I pictured his hands resting on mine, the subtle squeeze that conveys more than words could ever do. And for a moment, I let myself be enveloped in that imagined perfection, letting my heart dwell in anticipation. Minutes stretched like elastic. I checked my phone, even though I knew it would only display the ordinary, notifications, messages that weren't from him. The hum of the city carried on outside, the faint laughter of a neighbor in the corridor, a distant car pulling into the parking garage. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth anchor me, and reminded myself that anticipation is part of hope, and waiting is part of love. I moved around the apartment with quiet, ritualistic intent. The tablecloth was soft blush, echoing the roses. Napkins were folded with precision. Silverware gleamed under the morning light. Each movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each tiny action was an offering to the day I had imagined, to the belief that love, when anticipated, deserved respect and care. A small sound from the hallway pricked at the edges of my consciousness, a creak of the floorboards, a faint murmur of voices outside. I paused, a small unease brushing past me, almost imperceptible, yet enough to remind me that life has its unpredictabilities. I shook it off. Today was about belief, not suspicion. I rehearsed my words once more, murmuring them under my breath, the cadence, the softness, the hope embedded in every syllable. I did not overdo it. My voice was calm, measured, reflecting the internal readiness I had cultivated over weeks. Not desperation, not pleading, just trust, hope, and readiness to receive what was promised. Then my eyes returned to the card. The letters shimmered softly in the sunlight, the blush roses casting delicate shadows across the table. I traced the words lightly again, imagining him understanding the depth of my belief. The faint crease at the corner of the card, a subtle smudge near the signature, did not matter. Imperfections existed in reality, but today, the promise mattered more. I glanced at the scarf I had folded, then at the plate I had arranged for breakfast, the silver knife aligned just so, the toast lightly browned, and even the coffee mug angled toward him as if anticipating his presence. Each detail was a silent dialogue with my imagination, a conversation with my own heart. The room seemed to hold its breath with me, the silence almost sacred. Every small adjustment, every careful placement of objects was part of an invisible ritual, a preparation not just for him, but for the idea of love I still believed in. I walked slowly from the kitchen back to the bedroom, letting the ritual's quiet hum echo around me. The sunlight shifted slightly, catching the edge of the curtains, and I paused to appreciate the moment, a frozen frame of anticipation. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. What if anticipation is not always met with intention? What if hope alone is not enough? I let the thought linger only a second before I dismissed it. Faith is courage. Belief is power. I chose both, allowing the soft tension to remain, barely noticeable, like a whisper that hinted at uncertainty without breaking my composure. I sat back on the bed, folding my hands, looking at the bouquet, the card, the neatly arranged table, the coffee still warm. This was more than preparation. It was an homage to patience, to trust, to the fragile yet luminous act of believing in someone else with your heart open. I whispered to myself, softly, with no drama, no pleading, "Forever starts somewhere, even if not with him, yet." And as I watched the sunlight move across the floor, the distant laughter continue outside, and the city hum quietly, I realized today my hope was its own promise. My preparation, my belief, my quiet readiness, all of it carried weight. Even in the stillness, in the calm, love had begun. Not loud, not obvious, but present. The hour stretched onward. I did not know what would happen next. Would he appear as I had imagined? Would words spoken today match the rituals, the heartbeats, the unspoken expectations? I did not know, but I knew that even in waiting, I had already exercised courage, patience, and trust. And that, in itself, was enough to carry me forward into whatever proposed day would bring. The day had started with that soft, hopeful glow, the one that seemed to promise something lasting, something eternal. I still felt it lingering as I moved from the dining table back toward the kitchen, adjusting the small details I had so carefully arranged. The bouquet of blush roses remained untouched, the card shimmering under the soft morning light, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I had imagined his arrival countless times, rehearsing not just the words I would speak, but the tiny inflections, the pauses, the warmth in my smile. And yet, as the minutes stretched like elastic, a subtle unease began to weave its way into my chest, soft but persistent, almost imperceptible if I tried to dismiss it. The phone lay quietly on the counter, its screen dark, a gentle hum of anticipation in the background. I checked it again, my fingers brushing the smooth glass, hoping for a message or a notification that could assure me he was on his way. Nothing, not even a small ping. The silence was heavier than I expected, but I told myself it was just timing, just traffic, a simple delay. As I moved toward the living room to straighten the cushions on the sofa, the distant sound of a car horn pulled me briefly from my thoughts. A fleeting glance toward the window revealed a gray sedan idling at the corner. Unremarkable, yet it made me aware of the world beyond my carefully curated space. A laugh echoed faintly from the neighbor's yard, playful and warm, contrasting sharply with the tight knot forming in my stomach. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my hands, the ritual comforting, but the tension beneath it unshakable. Minutes passed with a rhythm that felt both eternal and suspended, the kind of time that makes one hyper-aware of each sound, each movement, each shadow. My fingers brushed the edge of the card again, tracing the delicate letters as if they could somehow translate my hope into reality. And then I heard it, the soft vibration of a phone from the hallway table, followed by a muffled conversation that immediately made my skin tighten. I paused, pretending to adjust the curtains, listening. His voice? No, but the tone, the words, the casual laughter, there was a familiarity that gnawed at me. A schedule? Another appointment? Or worse, someone else? My heart did not leap or panic, it simply settled into a heavy, sinking awareness. I realized I was not surprised, not yet, just the faint, stubborn recognition that the day might not unfold as I had imagined. The minutes were now punctuated by small interruptions, the soft click of a door shutting somewhere in the building, the subtle rustle of papers carried along the hallway, a distant ringtone, and the muted murmur of a voice too far to distinguish. Each sound became a punctuation mark in my internal narrative. I did not cry, I did not shout, I simply noted them, catalogued them, the way one might record a series of minor but telling irregularities. I returned to the kitchen, adjusting the mugs, pouring a fresh cup of coffee, running my fingers over the polished counter. Every small ritual, every sensory comfort I had orchestrated, the aroma of coffee, the gentle sunlight, the blush roses, the neatly folded napkins, was now tinged with a subtle shadow of doubt. My imagination, once a playground of hopeful anticipation, now rustled with possibilities I had refused to consider before. And yet, I maintained my composure. There was no dramatic collapse, no tearful outburst, just a quiet internal observation, noting patterns, discrepancies, and absences. The card remained on the table, its letters shimmering softly under the morning light, a reminder of trust placed and perhaps unreciprocated. I traced them lightly again, imagining not the words of promise I had rehearsed, but the weight of the silence that now filled the space between us. I thought back to all the small signals I might have overlooked, the slightly delayed texts, the missed calls, the subtle excuses that had once seemed trivial but now coalesced into a pattern I could no longer ignore. Each detail, when observed with quiet clarity, was a small fracture forming in the foundation of what I believed to be forever. And the realization was not dramatic, it was simply, inescapably, true. A calendar notification flashed silently on the screen, an appointment scheduled under his name that I had not been told about, yet it carried the same date, the same hour when I had imagined him kneeling, the words forever lingering in the air. The contrast between my expectations and reality settled into my chest like a stone. I did not panic, I did not accuse, I observed, catalogued, and acknowledged quietly. My fingers lingered on the coffee mug, the warmth grounding me, the sunlight soft across my lap. A receipt on the counter caught my eye, a minor detail from the previous day, its timestamp now strangely significant. I lifted it, studied the entries, noting inconsistencies. Small, silent betrayals accumulated, and with them, the subtle understanding that this was not a mistake, not an accident. It was a deliberate misalignment between words and actions, promises and documentation. I sat on the edge of the sofa, coffee in hand, inhaling the scent of roses, the warmth of morning sunlight, the quiet hum of the city outside. And I fought, without anger or bitterness. I didn't cry, I just stopped expecting. Those words anchored me. They were not a surrender, they were a quiet assertion of my own awareness, my own dignity intact. I understood now that the day had never truly belonged to the promises whispered in rehearsed smiles. It belonged to the reality unfolding quietly, deliberately around me. Even as I processed each signal, each small revelation, my movements remained deliberate and composed. I folded napkins with care, poured another cup of coffee, adjusted the bouquet slightly so the roses faced the sunlight. Each act was not resignation, but ritualistic preservation of normalcy, a quiet fortification against the internal fracture forming beneath the surface. By the time the city beyond my window had fully awakened, the cars, the distant chatter, the soft whir of the morning train, my mind was aligned with a subtle, unshakable awareness. The hope I had carried since the morning, once luminous and full, now rested beside a careful, observant clarity. The anticipation was no longer naive, it was measured, grounded in the knowledge that this day, so carefully orchestrated, carried both promise and the first glimmer of betrayal. The final moments of that morning were quiet. The bouquet, the card, the coffee, the carefully folded napkins all remained as they had been, symbols of what I had hoped for and what reality had quietly denied. I traced the letters on the card one last time, my fingertip lingering over the soft curves of ink, and whispered to myself, I am awake now. I see. And with that, I understood. The fracture was silent but complete. The day, once a canvas for dreams of forever, had become the quiet threshold of awareness. My heart did not break with a shout, it settled into a calm, deliberate observation, preparing me for the next phase, pattern recognition, clarity, and the eventual reclamation of control.
That doesn't scream, but whispers that something is off. I sat at the edge of our kitchen counter,
the aroma of half-brewed coffee curling around me, mingling with the faint scent of the roses I had placed the day before. My hands were idle, but my mind raced in ways I couldn't allow to show. For the first time, I wasn't waiting with hope, I was observing with purpose. The memory of his words from Propose Day, promising forever, replayed in my mind like a delicate melody I could no longer trust. I traced the sequence of events that had begun quietly, the delay in his calls, the small inconsistencies in his stories, the slight gaps in his schedule that once seemed trivial. Each of these small threads was beginning to weave a pattern I could no longer ignore. I pulled out my notebook from the drawer, its pages filled with tiny annotations over the past few weeks. Dates, times, and brief notes of seemingly inconsequential details stared back at me. There was the 9:45 a.m. text that had never been sent, the lunch meeting he claimed to have had with a client, the receipts I had found tucked in the glove compartment. Each piece of evidence building silently, methodically, into a picture I was only now brave enough to see. I could no longer mask the twinge in my chest as I recognized repetition, a rhythm of excuses that mirrored each other, as though rehearsed. The calendar he had shared with me looked neat and predictable on the surface, but cross-referencing with bank statements, text threads, and other logs revealed holes, gaps in time that had once been invisible. These weren't random errors, they were deliberate absences disguised as busyness, small betrayals hidden under the guise of normal life. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and let the silence of the apartment engulf me. The roses still sat in the vase on the counter, their blush pink petals seeming almost to mock the promises they were meant to symbolize. The engagement card lay beside them, untouched since the morning of Propose Day, its ink still fresh, its words full of hope I had once believed in. Now, those same words felt weightless, empty. Pulling my laptop closer, I opened the documents I had quietly compiled over weeks: meeting schedules, email threads, confirmations, legal notices, and even bank transfers. Each file was a puzzle piece, and I was the only one holding the frame. His carefully crafted persona of commitment was unraveling in the glow of my screen. Dates that once aligned perfectly with his rehearsed stories now contradicted the facts I had gathered. The pattern was irrefutable. This was no longer about love, it was about truth, I whispered to myself, the phrase feeling heavy yet liberating. The realization settled in my chest, a slow but steady beat of clarity replacing the fluttering hope that had dominated my heart. I felt a strange calmness seep into me, like the first quiet moments of dawn after a storm. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would come if needed, but right now, the power lay in observation, in preparation. I began organizing the documents in chronological order, each folder labeled meticulously. Receipts from cafes, emails confirming appointments he claimed were work-related, screenshots of messages he never thought I would notice, all aligned to reveal the inconsistencies. The mental image of him smiling and promising forever just days ago contrasted starkly with these quiet betrayals. Every detail, every timestamp, every document was now evidence in a story he had unwittingly authored. Small things that once seemed innocuous, the way he habitually leaned toward the door when a text came in, the faint hesitation in his tone when recalling minor plans, even the way he often walked past my favorite vase without touching it, now spoke volumes. Patterns of deception are subtle, almost imperceptible to the unobservant eye, but when you are trained to notice, every gesture becomes a line of truth. I had trained myself without realizing it, guided by instinct, self-respect, and an unwillingness to be deceived any longer. Hours passed in silence. I mapped out his weekly routines, cross-checked them with my own observations, and noted each anomaly. There was the Thursday evening meeting that lasted 2 hours too long, the Friday text that claimed he was running late but was time-stamped during his dinner elsewhere, the Saturday lunch with a friend he conveniently forgot to mention. They were threads I had once overlooked, dismissing them as coincidences or trivial. No longer. The roses on the counter, still fresh, were no longer symbols of anticipation. They were markers of the truth.
Every petal, every delicate blush of color became a reminder of how easily beauty can mask reality. The card with my trembling handwriting detailing our shared dreams now felt like a relic of innocence. I didn't feel naive, though. I felt observant, strategic, and quiet. I felt in control of the only thing I could control: my response, my actions, my dignity. I allowed myself to reflect on his promises once more. The forever he had spoken seemed almost theatrical now, a line delivered for performance, unanchored to reality. The act of proposing, the gentle tone, the soft touch of his hand, had been a mask. The truth, silent yet undeniable, was now unfolding before me. And I, for the first time in weeks, was no longer chasing the mirage of love. I was documenting truth, methodically, patiently, with the calm I hadn't thought I possessed. By late afternoon, the outline of his pattern was complete. Each discrepancy, each contradiction, each absence fit seamlessly into a web I had been assembling without confrontation or conversation. There was no shouting, no accusing, no dramatic outbursts, only observation, only clarity, only the knowledge that this pattern, once fully recognized, would speak louder than any words could. I paused, looking around the quiet apartment, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. I felt a strange gratitude for intuition, for patience, and for the quiet discipline that had allowed me to see beyond the surface. My heart was no longer heavy with naive hope. It was grounded in awareness. I could finally prepare, without haste, without panic, for the next step, when authority would enter the picture, when documentation would replace doubt, when silence would become power. Even as I organized every piece of evidence, a thought lingered. Love, as I had known it, was no longer the center of my story. The roses, the card, the whispered promises all had their place, but now they belonged to memory. The present demanded clarity, vigilance, and self-respect, and I was ready. I closed the final folder and leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. The city beyond the window hummed its familiar evening rhythm, oblivious to the quiet reckoning inside. Yet within me, a shift had occurred. The illusions of yesterday had been carefully unraveled, replaced by an unshakable awareness. This was no longer about love, it was about truth. I repeated, this time with a conviction that resonated in every corner of my being. Patterns had been recognized, evidence compiled, clarity achieved. I was no longer waiting for explanations. I was waiting for justice, procedural and calm, a quiet authority to validate the reality I had painstakingly observed. And as the last light of day faded, I felt a subtle but profound shift. The weight of uncertainty lifted, replaced by the quiet power of knowing. Proposed day had changed. The promises of forever had been unmasked, but in their place, I found an even stronger foundation: truth, dignity, and the calm anticipation of controlled action.
The day had settled into a quiet rhythm, yet an unmistakable sense of purpose lingered in the air. I moved through the apartment with deliberate calm, my steps measured, each motion carefully observed, as if every detail mattered more than ever before. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting patterned shadows across the floor, lines and angles that somehow reflected the clarity I was beginning to feel within myself. No longer caught in the haze of hope or disappointment, I carried a new focus: the meticulous assembly of truth. At my desk, a leather-bound folder lay open, its pages filled with receipts, timestamps, emails, and notes I had gathered over weeks of quiet observation. Each entry, each seemingly mundane detail, formed a mosaic of inconsistencies that no fleeting excuses could ever cover. I traced the lines of documents with my finger, absorbing the contradictions with a precision that felt almost meditative. Outside, the distant hum of traffic and muffled laughter from a neighbor seemed to fade into the background, leaving a space that belonged entirely to the rhythm of methodical preparation. I paused to make a call, connecting with the lawyer who would help formalize what I had quietly been organizing. Her voice was steady and professional, mirroring the tone I had adopted for myself over these past days.
There were no dramatics, no pleading, no raw emotion spilling over, only calm articulation and a shared understanding of the sequence of events that needed to be documented. I described, succinctly and clearly, every timeline discrepancy, every unexpected absence, every subtle contradiction in words versus actions. Her questions were precise, and in answering them, I realized how far I had already come from the woman who had once waited anxiously for an anticipated "I love you." The legal process began to feel like a structured choreography, each step deliberate, each document a part of a larger dance where control had replaced uncertainty. I reviewed the contracts he had signed, the meeting confirmations, the calendar alerts I had carefully saved. Every timestamp and signature became evidence of a reality I had only just started to fully comprehend. It was not about vindictiveness or exposing him publicly. It was about reclaiming authority over my life, using clarity and documentation as my tools. While compiling the evidence, I arranged the items not just by date, but by thematic relevance. Propose Day, once a symbol of romantic expectation, now stood starkly against the pattern of deceit I had uncovered. The contrast between what was promised and what was performed became almost palpable. The bouquet untouched on the counter, the card lying face up with unspoken words, the faint echo of rehearsed smiles that had never met their mark. Each element reinforced my understanding that love had been interwoven with calculated omission, and the realization no longer carried bitterness, it carried precision. As the afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, I methodically went over my notes. Every email I had flagged, every calendar discrepancy, every financial inconsistency had its place. I created an organized timeline that could withstand scrutiny, a coherent narrative built from observation, not speculation. The act of assembling these facts became unexpectedly empowering. In the silence of the apartment, I felt a growing strength, an internal authority that required no outburst, no confrontation. My calm had become a weapon, and yet it was wielded without aggression. Later, I sat back, sipping a cup of tea I had prepared hours ago, and reflected on the contrast between anticipation and control. The excitement I had once felt on Propose Day, the fluttering hope, the rehearsed words, the imagined forever, was now replaced by measured clarity. I was no longer waiting for his affirmations or excuses. I was preparing for an outcome that depended solely on the truth I had documented. Every record, every note, every timestamp was a silent witness to the pattern that had eluded me before. The evening grew quieter, the soft light from the city outside seeping through the blinds like a muted applause. I reviewed the folder one last time, making subtle adjustments, aligning pages, adding clarifying notes, and ensuring that the narrative I was building could withstand scrutiny and convey the story accurately. There was no urgency in my movements, only purpose. The act of organization, so procedural and calm, felt like an affirmation of self-respect. I realized then that authority did not need to shout, it did not demand attention, it simply existed, undeniable and structured. In one particularly reflective moment, I glanced at the engagement card I had placed beside the records. Its edges were slightly curled, a quiet testament to days of anticipation and subtle heartbreak. I traced the handwriting with my eyes, noting how the ink had faded slightly over time. The symbolism was stark. What once carried the warmth of expectation now rested in a space of factual clarity. Love, I understood, could be observed, analyzed, and transformed into a force that was both disciplined and potent. By nightfall, the folder was complete, every detail meticulously cataloged, every pattern clearly demonstrated. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of calm reflection. The silent power I now carried was unlike any reassurance love could offer. It was rooted in evidence, in preparation, in the quiet certainty that action grounded in truth would prevail. Outside, the city lights shimmered, distant yet indifferent, a reminder that the world continued while I methodically reclaimed my space, my dignity, and my voice. The shift from hope to authority was subtle but profound. I no longer required his explanations, his reassurances, or his promises. I had constructed my own framework of power, one that demanded no argument and no emotional display. In this quiet, procedural environment, I realized that patience and precision could achieve what confrontation could not. The pattern I had observed, documented, and structured was no longer merely a record. It was an assertion of control, a reclaiming of agency that could not be interrupted by his presence or absence. As I prepared to close the day, I took a final look at the documents and evidence I had compiled. Every note, every receipt, every digital trace was aligned to present a coherent narrative, one that spoke of accountability, truth, and measured authority. The air in the apartment felt different now, lighter, more deliberate, and unmistakably mine. My resolve had transformed from silent observation into quiet mastery, and I understood that the outcome, though still unseen, was already tilting in favor of clarity and dignity. Even in the subtle gestures of turning a page or reviewing a timestamp, I sensed the empowerment of knowing, of controlling the narrative without aggression. Silence had become my tool, preparation my ally, and careful documentation my shield. Propose Day, once a symbol of hope and expectation, now existed in contrast to the evidence I had amassed, reinforcing the profound shift from trust to strategic authority. By the time I set the folder aside and dimmed the lights, I felt an unshakable calm. Every step I had taken, careful, deliberate, methodical, was a declaration of power without confrontation. The city outside, oblivious to the internal calculations and strategic patience, carried on in its rhythms. Inside, I had constructed a controlled space of awareness and authority. The quiet shift from emotional anticipation to disciplined empowerment was complete, and with it, I realized that action grounded in truth could never be undermined by false promises.
The morning sunlight seeped gently through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. It wasn't the same light I had once waited for him under, full of hopeful anticipation, but it was comforting nonetheless. Calm, unassuming, and real. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma grounding me in a quiet reality I had only begun to fully accept. There was no lingering tension in the air, no drama waiting to erupt. Everything had shifted, and I could feel it, not in anger, but in measured awareness. The legal process had run its course. Every document I had meticulously organized, every timestamp, every calendar note, every message I had quietly observed and filed away, everything had led to this. He had signed the papers, affirming a reality I had known was coming, but had feared facing directly. There were no shouting matches, no vindictive speeches, just the procedural affirmation of truth. My heart, once tangled in hope and disbelief, now beat with measured clarity. I had transformed anticipation into preparation, betrayal into understanding, and hurt into quiet authority. I walked slowly through the apartment, each step deliberate. The bouquet from Propose Day still rested on the counter, slightly wilted but still vibrant in its blush pink petals. Once, that bouquet had symbolized a promise I thought unbreakable. Now, it was a reminder of resilience. I picked it up, feeling the softness of the petals, tracing them with a finger as though connecting the past to the present. I didn't dwell on what could have been. I simply acknowledged what had been and what I had survived. Each small ritual, morning coffee, the folded napkins on the counter, the neatly aligned books on the shelf, was now infused with a sense of ownership over my life. I glanced out the window. The city moved on, unaware of the quiet storm that had passed within these walls. Cars honked in the distance, a dog barked, and neighbors' laughter floated faintly across the street. These ordinary sounds, once background noise to the chaos of expectation and betrayal, now felt grounding. They reminded me that life moved forward, that the world was wider than the disappointment I had carried, and that my own stability could flourish amidst it. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling warmth spread through my chest, a quiet comfort that no one could take from me. The realization struck me fully then. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove anything. The law, the records, the clear patterns I had followed, those had spoken louder than any outburst could.
I had reclaimed not just my dignity, but my autonomy. The independence I felt wasn't just legal, it was emotional, spiritual, and visceral. I could plan my days without reference to him, dream without hesitation, and trust myself fully. The world beyond these walls felt expansive again, filled with possibility rather than restraint. Sitting at the small dining table, I laid out the documents one final time. Each sheet reflected meticulous attention and unwavering integrity. I could see the timeline of our relationship etched in ink, marked by patterns of promises, repeated words, and actions that no longer held sway over me. I traced my finger along one particular note, a quiet smile crossing my lips. Not bitter, not resentful, simply acknowledging that I had endured, understood, and emerged unbroken. The weight of betrayal had transformed into a mantle of clarity. My heart, once heavy with confusion, now rested in certainty. Later, I found myself walking through the living room, letting my hands brush over surfaces I once shared with him. The subtle textures of the furniture, the gentle hum of the air conditioner, the sunlight glinting off the window panes, all these small details grounded me. I paused near the bookshelf, a faint smile crossing my face as I ran my hand along the spines of books I had carefully arranged. Every choice, every action I had taken to maintain my own order and integrity now felt purposeful, a silent assertion of control over my world. I paused by the mirror, meeting my own eyes. For a long time, I had wondered if I would recognize myself again after the series of quiet betrayals, the absence of what I had expected, the fractured promises that had once filled my heart. But the reflection staring back at me was composed, aware, and grounded. It was a face that had carried pain yet never lost grace, a woman who had observed without rage, strategized without malice, and emerged not diminished but empowered. The proposed day bouquet remained on the counter, a gentle symbol of the past, now reframed. I did not feel the sting of disappointment anymore. I felt the quiet strength of knowing that my life was mine to guide. I had honored my own trust, respected my own judgment, and ensured that the truth would stand on its own. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was decisive. The papers, the lawyer's confirmations, the procedural resolutions, they had all validated what I had quietly understood for weeks. My dignity could not be undermined, my clarity could not be shaken, and my future was firmly in my own hands. I took one last sip of coffee, savoring the warmth and the calm. A soft breeze brushed against my face through the slightly open window, carrying the faint scent of spring flowers from outside. I felt a sense of closure that was both gentle and profound. The day, once marked by anticipation and fragile hope, had transformed into a marker of resilience and authority. What proposed day meant in the past, promises, hope, and expectation, had evolved into a testament of self-respect, clarity, and independence. As the sun climbed higher, I set the empty cup down and allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. I had navigated the storm of betrayal without losing my composure, without letting bitterness dictate my actions. I had reclaimed my space, my time, my voice, and in that reclamation there was peace, steady, calm, and unwavering. Finally, I whispered to myself, softly but firmly, I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to prove, I just reclaimed myself. The world outside continued its rhythm, indifferent yet constant, and I moved forward within it, whole, dignified, and fully in control of the life I had fought to reclaim.